The galaxy was a dangerous place, and Kivera knew it better than anyone. She had lived most of her life in the shadows, a cold-hearted assassin feared by countless planets. Her species, the Psychor, were massive and strong, with scales that glimmered in the dark and eyes that could see across light years. She was a warrior, trained for battle, and her reputation spread like wildfire. Those who hired her never asked questions, and those who were her targets rarely survived to tell the tale. But now, Kivera was the one being hunted. Her last contract had been a risky one, assassinating a galactic senator who was rumored to be involved in shady dealings with pirates. It had gone well at first. The senator was dead, and Kivera had completed the job with the usual efficiency. However, the senator's death had triggered a wave of chaos that Kivera had not anticipated. The bounty hunters, mercenaries, and law enforcement agencies of the galaxy had all joined forces to track her down. The hunt was relentless, from the icy moons of the Shora system to the crowded streets of the capital city on Artilla 9. Kivera had been chased across countless worlds. She had fought, hidden, and outrun her pursuers again and again. But this time, things were different. The hunters were closing in faster than she could escape, and she had nowhere left to run. Her latest hideout, a desolate mining moon on the edge of known space, had been compromised. A group of bounty hunters had found her. The moon's surface was covered in dusty plains, scattered with abandoned mining equipment. The only thing Kivera could use to her advantage was the thick fog that rolled in from the dark craters, hiding her movements. But even that wasn't enough to make her feel safe. Her usual methods of escape, blending into the environment, creating distractions, and disappearing into the shadows, weren't working anymore. She was getting tired. Too tired. Kivera crouched low behind a rusty cargo container, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The sound of footsteps echoed through the fog. They were getting closer, 5 of them. They moved in perfect coordination, their weapons raised, their senses sharp. These weren't amateurs. These were professionals. With a deep breath, Kivera adjusted her blaster and checked her combat knives, making sure they were within reach. She wasn't going down without a fight. She had been in worse situations before and had always found a way out. But the weight of exhaustion pressed down on her, and for the first time in a long while, doubt crept into her mind. Suddenly, a sharp crack sounded through the fog. One of the bounty hunters had triggered a sensor. The others quickly moved to position themselves around Kivera's last known location. The trap was closing. Kivera's pulse quickened. Her mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. There were only a few places left for her to run, and none of them offered a safe escape. Her eyes darted over the craggy terrain, seeking an opening. There, a transport ship parked on the far side of the mining field, its engines idling quietly. It wasn't much, but it was her only chance. She made a decision in an instant. She would fight her way out, make a last stand, and buy enough time to reach the ship. But just as she prepared to spring into action, something strange happened. The sound of gunfire rang out, not from the bounty hunters, but from the opposite direction. A blast of red energy cut through the air, striking one of the bounty hunters square in the chest. The hunter collapsed, lifeless, without a sound. Kivera froze, her heart pounding. More shots followed, and soon, the fog was filled with the sounds of distant explosions. Whoever was firing was incredibly accurate, and they weren't aiming for her. She quickly crouched lower, using the cover of the container to hide. Her eyes narrowed as she tried to see who was attacking the bounty hunters. Through the thick fog, a silhouette appeared, a ship, small and unremarkable, but unmistakably a freighter. Its engines were glowing, and it was flying low to the ground, firing blasts at the bounty hunters. The ship swooped in close, and from its open cargo hold, a figure appeared, human, tall and lean, with a rugged look. The figure was armed with a high-powered blaster, picking off the bounty hunters one by one. It was no coincidence that the ship had come to her aid. But why? Kivera didn't have time to think. She saw her opportunity and ran. As she sprinted toward the ship, the last of the bounty hunters were distracted by the incoming fire. She could hear them shouting, trying to regroup. Kivera pushed her body to its limit, her long legs eating up the distance between her and the ship. The human on board must have seen her coming, because the cargo bay doors started to open just as she reached the ship. With a final burst of speed, Kivera leaped into the open hold. The doors slammed shut behind her, and the ship took off into the sky, leaving the bounty hunters behind. Inside the hold, Kivera collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. Her heart was still racing, and her mind was in chaos. She had escaped, but who was this human, and why had they helped her? Before she could gather her thoughts, the human appeared in the doorway, a steady hand on his blaster. He didn't look afraid. In fact, he looked curious. "Didn't think I'd find someone like you out here," he said, his voice rough but calm. "You owe me an explanation, lady." Kivera looked up at him, her mind still spinning. She had just been saved by a human, someone who should have been her enemy, or at the very least indifferent. But now, as she stared into his eyes, she realized something she hadn't expected. This might be the first time in her life that someone had truly seen her as something more than just a killer. And that thought, more than anything, made her pause. Sam sat in the cockpit of his freighter, staring out into the cold void of space. The stars twinkled like tiny lights, but his mind was elsewhere, far away from the routine cargo runs that had filled his life in recent years. He wasn't the soldier he used to be, not since the war had ended. He had left the military behind, hoping to find peace, but the universe had other plans. His ship, the Nomad, was a sturdy vessel, old but reliable. Sam had picked it up from a scrapyard on a backwater planet a few years ago, and it had become his home ever since. His crew was small, just him and his Tessa, who handled most of the ship's systems. Life was simple, sometimes too simple. Cargo runs, refueling stations, and a few drinks at the local bar. But that all changed when he found her. He wasn't expecting to stumble upon the alien assassin. Kivera had been cornered on that mining moon when he had first seen her, her eyes wild with desperation, her movements like a deadly dance. He had thought about turning around, leaving her to her fate, but something had stopped him. Perhaps it was the memory of his old squad, the ones he couldn't save, or maybe it was just the sight of someone who needed help. Either way, Sam had decided to intervene. The moment she had jumped into his cargo bay, he knew he had made the right choice. The strange alien woman, tall and powerful, with scales covering her skin, was more than just a fugitive. Sam could see it in her eyes, a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and anger. She wasn't just running from the law. She was running from something deeper, something that had haunted her for a long time. Sam hadn't asked her for her story, not yet. He had enough trouble of his own, especially after a run-in with a gang of pirates last week that had left his ship damaged. But he knew he had made a dangerous gamble. He had no idea who Kivera was or why she was being hunted, but one thing was clear: her enemies were ruthless. As the Nomad sailed further into the void, Sam glanced over at her. She was sitting on the bench across from him, her eyes closed, resting. Her breathing was slow, but her body was tense, as though ready to spring into action at any moment. Sam had seen soldiers like her before, trained killers, ones who never let their guard down. He could tell she wasn't the kind of person who trusted easily, and he didn't blame her. "I'm Sam," he said, breaking the silence. Kivera opened her eyes slowly, studying him for a moment before answering. Her voice was rough, like gravel being ground together. "I know who you are." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what do you know?" "You're a courier, ex-soldier, not much else," Kivera replied flatly. "Ex-soldier, huh?" Sam chuckled softly. "I guess you're good at reading people." Kivera didn't smile. "I'm good at surviving." Sam nodded. He could see that. "You're not from around here, are you?" She didn't answer, instead looking out the window into the stars, her eyes distant. Sam didn't press her for more. He had his own demons, things he didn't like to talk about, things that still haunted him from his time in the military. The last thing he wanted was for Kivera to feel like she had to tell him her life story. "So," Sam said, turning back to his controls, "what's the deal with you? I mean, I know you're a killer, but why are they hunting you so hard?" Kivera's eyes narrowed, but she didn't answer right away. Her gaze shifted to the floor, as if searching for the right words. "I'm not a killer," she finally said, her voice low. "I was forced into it." Sam didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't need to. He had seen people broken by war before, people who had been pushed into violence, people who had no choice. He understood what she meant. "The Empire destroyed my planet," Kivera continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They enslaved my people and used us as tools for their wars. I didn't choose this life. It was forced on me." Sam's heart sank. He had heard stories about the Empire, the way they swept across planets, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. But hearing it from her, seeing the pain in her eyes, made it real. "Sounds like you've been through hell," Sam said softly. Kivera didn't respond. Instead, she stood up and walked over to the small window, staring out into the blackness of space. The silence between them stretched on. Sam wasn't sure what he had expected. He wasn't looking for a sob story. But there was something about Kivera that made him want to help her. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't just a cold killer. She was someone who had been broken by the galaxy. And maybe, just maybe, she could be healed. "I didn't expect you to help me," Kivera said suddenly, breaking the silence. Sam looked over at her. "Why not? You're human. You should be afraid of me." "I'm not afraid of you," Sam replied simply. Kivera turned to face him, a look of surprise crossing her face. For the first time since he had met her, there was a crack in her hard exterior. "Why?" "Because I've met people like you before. People who were forced into things they didn't want. People who did things they regret. But you're not your past." Kivera's eyes softened, just for a moment, before she hardened again. "I don't deserve your kindness." Sam shook his head. "No one's beyond redemption, not even you. But only if you want it." The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. For the first time in a long time, Kivera let her guard down, just a little. And Sam knew that, somehow, his gamble had paid off. He wasn't sure where this strange journey would lead them, but he knew one thing for sure. They were in this together now. Days passed as the Nomad traveled deeper into the galaxy, the vastness of space stretching out before them. Sam and Kivera had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was simply the calm of two people who weren't sure if they could trust each other, but were learning to survive together. Sam kept his distance. He had offered her a place on the ship, but it didn't mean he understood her fully, nor did she understand him. She was a warrior, and he was a man trying to outrun his past. He didn't expect her to suddenly change, but there was something in her eyes that made him wonder if she wanted to. Kivera, for her part, stayed mostly in the shadows of the ship. She wasn't comfortable in the small, human-made space. She preferred the control of the open sky and the comfort of knowing she could escape if needed. But Sam had given her a place to stay, not as a prisoner, but as someone who had nowhere else to go. It was a strange feeling, one she hadn't known in years. It was on the third day that the silence finally broke. They were sitting in the cockpit. Sam was flying the ship, his hands moving over the controls with practiced ease, while Kivera stood by the window, watching the stars. She had been quiet for most of the journey, her thoughts her own. But today, something was different. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she needed to know more about Sam. "How did you end up in this line of work?" Kivera asked, her voice cutting through the quiet. Sam glanced at her, surprised by the question. He had figured she would ask about his past eventually, but he wasn't sure he was ready to share. Still, he'd been helping her, and he knew it wasn't right to keep his story locked away forever. "I was a medic," he said, his voice steady. "In the military. I joined when I was young. Thought I could make a difference. But the war, it changes people. We lost a lot of good men out there. I lost my squad in a firefight. After that, I didn't have much left." Kivara watched him closely, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of his expression. "I've seen the same thing," she said quietly. "The war, the destruction, it changes you, makes you see the world differently." Sam didn't reply immediately. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what she meant. The scars of war weren't just physical. They lingered in the mind, in the heart. It was a weight that never went away. "So why this?" Kivara continued, her voice skeptical. "Why become a courier? You could have stayed in the military, or done something else. Why this life?" Sam sighed. "Because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't have a home anymore, not after the war. So I started flying, transporting goods. No fighting, just keeping to myself." "We need to lay low for a while," he said, his voice calm but serious. "The pirates won't be the last of our problems. You're a wanted woman now, and anyone with a bounty on their head is going to attract attention." Kivara nodded, her gaze fixed on the view outside. She had been thinking the same thing. "I know," she replied quietly. "I can't keep running forever." Sam looked over at her. "You could stay here, on this ship, keep helping me with the cargo runs. We'll keep our heads down, and maybe you can find a way to lose the bounty hunters." Kivara turned to him, surprised by his offer. She hadn't expected it. She hadn't expected him to trust her this much. "And you trust me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam paused before answering. "You've had my back. That's more than I can say for most people I've met." He ran a hand through his hair. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy. We'll have to be careful. But it's better than being on the run alone." Kivara studied him for a moment, trying to understand his reasoning. It didn't make sense to her. She was a killer, a person who had done terrible things, and yet he was offering her something no one had ever offered, a place to belong. For the first time in a long time, she wondered if she could actually trust him. "I'm not what you think I am," Kivara said, her voice low. "I've killed people. I've done things. I don't know if I can ever be different." Sam met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Everyone has a past. What matters is what you do with your future. You're here now. That's what counts." For a long moment, Kivara didn't say anything. She had spent so many years running, so many years trying to escape her past, that she didn't know if she could believe what Sam was offering. But there was something about him, a quiet strength, a calmness in the face of danger, that made her think that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't like everyone else. "We'll have to be careful," Kivara said finally, breaking the silence. "The bounty hunters won't stop. They'll come for me, and they won't stop until they have me." "I'll keep you safe," Sam said, his voice firm. She looked at him, a small flicker of doubt in her eyes. "You don't know what they'll do to you if they find out you're helping me." Sam shrugged. "I'm used to danger. I've been in worse situations before. And if it comes down to it, I'll deal with it. But I don't think they'll find us that easily." Kivara studied him for a moment. She was used to running, used to looking over her shoulder, but for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to. Sam was offering her something that seemed impossible. A chance at peace, a chance to start over. It was tempting, more tempting than anything she had ever felt. But it also made her vulnerable, something she hadn't been in a long time. "I don't know if I can let go of the past," Kivara said quietly. "I've been a killer for so long. I don't know how to be anything else." "You don't have to let go of the past right away," Sam replied. "You can take your time. All I'm asking is that you trust me, just a little." Kivara's gaze softened as she considered his words. She had never trusted anyone before, not truly. But Sam was different. He had proven that. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she was willing to try. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'll stay. For now." Sam gave a small nod, a smile tugging at his lips. "Good. We've got a long road ahead of us, but we'll get through it. Together." The words hung in the air between them, unspoken promises. They both knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The bounty hunters would be relentless. The galaxy would never stop trying to tear them apart. But for the first time in a long time, they had each other. And for Kivara, that was enough. The Nomad continued its journey through the stars, but the sense of calm that had settled between Sam and Kivara was slowly fading. They had agreed to work together, to lay low for a while, and keep the bounty hunters off their trail. But deep down, they both knew that the peace they had found was fragile. The galaxy didn't let go of people like Kivara easily, and sooner or later, someone would come looking for her. Sam kept the ship on course, the familiar hum of the engines almost comforting in its steadiness. But he wasn't fooling himself. There were whispers about him now, about his connection to a wanted assassin. And he could feel it. People like Kivara didn't escape the attention of the galaxy's most dangerous factions. Sam had never been a coward, but he knew the risks. The last time he had been involved in something like this, people had died. He wasn't ready to see that happen again, especially not to someone who had started to mean something to him. Kivara, for her part, had mostly kept to herself since the pirate attack. She wasn't one for small talk, but the silence between them had grown heavy. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her sometimes, like he was trying to figure her out. She wasn't sure she wanted him to. Her past was a tangled mess of secrets, and not all of them were her own. There were things she had done, things she had been forced to do, that she couldn't undo. She had spent years running from her demons, but the truth was, they were always waiting for her. She had learned to live with that. The real question was whether Sam could. After a few more quiet days, the uneasy calm finally shattered. It was late in the evening when the alert came through. Sam was in the cockpit, tinkering with some of the ship's equipment, when the message pinged on his console. His heart sank as he saw the name. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. The transmission was from an old contact, one he hadn't heard from in years. His name was Merrick, and he was a fixer, someone who knew how to find people in the galaxy. The kind of person you called when you needed something or someone. Disappeared. Sam had worked with Merrick before, but that was a lifetime ago. He didn't want anything to do with that life now. Kivara appeared in the doorway, sensing something was wrong. She had a sixth sense about these things, especially when it came to danger. "What is it?" she asked, her voice sharp. Sam hesitated before replying. "It's Merrick. He's the one who put the bounty on your head." Kivara's eyes narrowed. "I should have known." "I didn't want to believe it," Sam said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But he's the kind of guy who gets paid to find people like you." "Then why are you still talking to him?" Kivara asked, her voice growing colder. "Because I don't have a choice," Sam said, his jaw tightening. "He's a shadow in this part of the galaxy. And if he knows we're together, he'll sell us out. We won't survive that." Kivara crossed her arms, her mind racing. "What does he want?" Sam hesitated, glancing at the screen. "Information. He wants to know where you're hiding." Kivara clenched her fists. She knew this was coming. The galaxy never let anyone stay hidden for long. But Merrick's interest wasn't just about money. He had his own agenda. And Kivara knew it. She had crossed paths with him before, and he was someone who didn't let go. "He can't know where we are," she said, her voice low. "If he does, it's over." Sam nodded. "I know. But the question is, what do we do now?" Kivara didn't answer right away. She was already thinking, calculating. She had been on the run long enough to know how to survive. Running wasn't an option, not anymore. If they stayed on the defensive, they would never be safe. They needed to take the fight to Merrick. "We make sure he doesn't find us," Kivara said, her voice cold. "We don't run from him. We take him down first." Sam's eyes widened in surprise. "You want to go after Merrick? Are you crazy?" Kivara met his gaze, her expression hard. "I've faced worse than Merrick, and I'm not going to let him track me down like an animal. We fight back." Sam stared at her, his mind racing. He didn't know if she was right, but one thing was clear: if they stayed hidden, they would never get the peace they were looking for. Merrick had the power to destroy everything they had worked for, and Sam wasn't about to let that happen. "You're sure about this?" Sam asked, his voice serious. Kivara nodded. "I've been running from people like him for too long. It's time to end it." Sam sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right, but we're doing this my way. No head-on assaults. We'll outsmart him. We'll make him think we're somewhere else." Kivara smirked, a rare look of amusement on her face. "I'm not the one who needs a plan. You're the one who knows how to think ahead. I'll follow your lead." Sam didn't have time to argue. He pulled up the coordinates of a nearby system, a place Merrick wouldn't expect them to be. It was far from the usual trade routes, a place where smugglers and outcasts gathered. It was their best shot at losing Merrick for good. "We'll need to lay low, and I'll need your help to cover our tracks," Sam said, his voice steady. "It won't be easy, but it's the best chance we got." Kivara gave a sharp nod. "I'm ready." As Sam set the ship's course for the hidden system, he couldn't help but feel a surge of determination. They were in this together now, and no matter what, he would protect her, because, for the first time in a long time, he had something to fight for. The Nomad sailed through the empty space, its sleek hull cutting through the dark like a shadow. Sam kept his hand steady on the controls, his eyes focused on the holographic map in front of him. He was taking them to a place few people would think to look, a forgotten station in the depths of a cold, uninhabited sector. It was the perfect hiding spot, or so he hoped. Kivara, standing behind him in the cockpit, watched the stars slip by. She had already cleaned her weapons, checking them for the third time that day. It was a habit, a survival instinct. Even when things seemed calm, she never let her guard down. Not when she was this close to being hunted. "Almost there," Sam said quietly, glancing back at her. Kivara nodded, her gaze hard. She didn't trust the quiet, the calm. There was always something just out of sight, something lurking in the shadows. She knew it wasn't just Merrick they had to worry about now. They were being hunted, and the closer they got to safety, the more dangerous things would become. "We're going to need more than just hiding if Merrick finds us," Kivara said, her voice steady but filled with a dangerous edge. "You know that, right?" "I know," Sam replied, his eyes narrowing as he studied the blinking lights on his console. "But right now, we need time. If we can shake him off, even for a little while, we'll have a better chance of staying ahead." Kivara didn't respond. She was used to the chase. She had been running for years, and it was always the same. Hide, run, fight. It never ended. But something about Sam, something about this partnership, made her feel like they might have a chance. Maybe. She just wasn't sure how long that feeling would last. The station came into view, a dark, rusted structure floating silently in the distance. It was barely a blip on the radar, and that's exactly what made it perfect. It was forgotten, left behind by the galactic powers that had once built it. Now it was home only to smugglers, outcasts, and those trying to escape from something or someone. Sam slowed the ship's engines, bringing the Nomad in for a smooth landing. The station was quiet, as expected, with no sign of other ships nearby. It was perfect for their plan. But even as they settled down, Kivara couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Once the ship was secure, Sam turned to her. "We'll stay here for a few days. Lay low, check the local communications. If Merrick's still looking, we'll figure out a way to misdirect him." Kivara didn't argue. She was already checking the ship's weapons systems, making sure everything was in order. She didn't trust the station or its inhabitants, but it was the best they had for now. The moment the ship's hatch opened, the smell of rust and old machinery hit them. The station was a mess, dark, with flickering lights and walls that seemed to be on the verge of collapsing. But it was empty. There was no one around, not a single sign of life. It was perfect, and yet something felt wrong. "I'll check the communications hub," Sam said, pulling a small device from his jacket. "Keep an eye out. I'll be quick." Kivara nodded, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade as she moved toward the entrance of the ship. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but she wasn't going to let her guard down. Sam had gone to work, and she was left with her thoughts and her instincts. As she stood near the entrance, her sharp eyes scanned the shadows around them. The station was eerily silent. Too silent. There should have been sounds of people, of life, somewhere. But there was nothing. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. A low sound broke the silence. Footsteps, light but fast. Kivara's hand instinctively moved to her blade, her body tensing as she scanned the space. But when she turned, there was nothing. The sound had stopped. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong, that they weren't alone. Suddenly, Sam's voice came over the comms, his tone sharp. "Kivara, get back to the ship now." Kivara didn't hesitate. She bolted toward the ship, her footsteps echoing in the empty station. As she ran, the sound of those footsteps returned, growing louder behind her. She didn't need to look to know she was being followed. By the time she reached the Nomad, she saw Sam standing near the hatch, his face tense with concern. "We've got company," he said, urgency in his voice. "Multiple ships incoming." Kivara's heart skipped a beat. "Merrick." "No," Sam replied, his voice grim. "Worse." Kivara's eyes narrowed as she stepped inside the ship. "What do you mean, worse?" Before Sam could answer, the warning lights flashed again. The station's systems came alive, flickering with activity. A signal was coming through, one that Kivara recognized immediately. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. "It's a trap." "Who?" Sam asked, his voice low. Kivara didn't have to explain. She knew exactly who had followed them here. A group of bounty hunters, notorious for their brutal efficiency. And they weren't here just for the reward. They were here to make an example of her. "I'm not running this time," Kivara said, her voice cold. "We fight." Sam didn't argue. "I'll set up the defenses. You take the guns." Kivara didn't hesitate. She was ready. The fight was coming, and this time she wasn't backing down. She knew she couldn't do this alone. But with Sam by her side, they might just stand a chance. The Nomad was alive with the sound of alarms, flashing lights reflecting off the metal walls as Sam worked quickly to prepare for the worst. Kivara stood by the ship's main guns, checking the targeting system and making sure the weaponry was ready. The bounty hunters were closing in, and there was no time to waste. 3 ships, Sam muttered as he scanned the incoming signals. "We don't have long." Kivara's eyes narrowed, and she gripped the controls of the gunner station. "Then we don't waste time." "Hold on," Sam said, his voice steady but tense. He started to make adjustments to the ship's systems, trying to find a way to stay hidden for just a little longer. But there was no escaping this. The bounty hunters had found them, and now they were going to make sure they didn't escape again. "Sam," Kivara called out, "we're out of time." She didn't need to tell him. He could see the enemy ships on his radar, coming in fast. He looked over at Kivara, who was already moving into position. The tension in the air was thick, but there was no fear in her eyes. She was ready for this fight, just like every other battle she had faced before. "We fight," Kivara said, her voice quiet but fierce. Sam nodded. He wasn't afraid either. Not anymore. They had come this far, and he wasn't about to let some bounty hunters end it all. Not without a fight. Kivara activated the guns, and the Nomad shuddered as the first blast ripped through the air. The bounty hunters' ships were closing in, but Kivara's aim was precise. The first ship exploded in a fiery ball of debris, and Kivara smiled grimly. That was one down. But there were still two more. Sam adjusted the ship's speed, darting left and right to avoid enemy fire. The bounty hunters weren't holding back. They were coming in fast, firing relentlessly. Sam's fingers danced over the controls as he worked to keep them alive, while Kivara kept firing, taking down one ship after another. Another explosion rocked the Nomad, and Sam's heart skipped a beat. "We've got more incoming," he warned. Kivara didn't flinch. She was already tracking the next target. The remaining two ships came at them from both sides, but Kivara was ready. She fired again, the blast tearing through the side of one ship, sending it spiraling out of control. Another ship down, but the last one was still coming. "They're not giving up," Sam said, his eyes scanning the ship's systems. "We need to finish this fast." The final ship was closing in fast, and Sam could see the guns charging up. He didn't have much time. He had to make a decision. They couldn't dodge forever, and the Nomad wasn't built for sustained combat. They needed a way out. "Get ready," Kivara called out, locking on to the last ship. Her voice was calm, steady, even as explosions rocked the station around them. Sam quickly punched in a series of commands. "I'm setting up an EMP blast," he said, his voice focused. "It'll take down their systems for a few seconds, enough for us to finish them off." Kivara nodded. "Do it." Sam hit the button, and the ship's systems hummed as the EMP charged. In seconds, the last bounty hunter's ship was in range. Kivara locked onto it, her finger hovering over the trigger. She felt a surge of adrenaline. The Nomad rocked again as the EMP fired, and the remaining ship's systems went dark. Now was the time. Kivara unleashed everything the ship had, firing the final shot. The last ship exploded into a fireball, the debris scattering into the cold void of space. The Nomad was silent for a moment. Kivara stared at the empty space outside the ship's windows, breathing heavily. Her heart was still racing from the fight, but there was no time to relax. She glanced over at Sam, who was checking the ship's systems again, making sure they were still intact. "We did it," Sam said, his voice a little strained but relieved. Kivara didn't respond at first. She was still processing what had just happened. The adrenaline was fading, but the reality of what they had just survived was still hitting her. She had killed before, yes. She had fought for her life many times, but this was different. This time, they'd fought together, and it had made all the difference. She finally nodded, her eyes meeting Sam's. "We did, but don't think we're safe yet. There will be others." Sam's expression turned serious. "I know, but for now, we've got a little time. Let's use it." He turned back to the controls, beginning the process of checking their course and systems. He wasn't sure what was next for them, but one thing was clear: they were stronger together. And maybe, just maybe, they could survive this galaxy after all. For Kivara, this wasn't the end of the fight, but as she looked over at Sam, she realized it didn't have to be the end of her hope either. They had fought back. They had won. And that was enough. For now.